The cerebral hemispheres are the highest portion of the brain, and you have a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere. Each hemisphere, or side of the brain, has 5 lobes. Many people believe it's only 4, but there are 5, but you can only see 4. We have the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, the occipital lobe, and if we peel this away, we see one inside called the insula. So the frontal lobes are the areas that involve thinking, coordination, and strategy. This is concentration, planning, problem solving. We also have the primary motor cortex. So all of your movement is initiated from the frontal lobes in an area called the primary motor cortex. Next, you have the parietal lobes. The parietal lobes are located farther back on the top, and the parietal lobes are your primary sensory area, meaning that everything that you touch and feel with your hands and your body comes into the parietal lobes in an area called the somatosensory cortex. So the frontal lobes have the motor cortex causing you to move, and the parietal lobes have the sensory cortex so you can perceive touch. The parietal also is speech and words, so processing speech and words. Now we have motor speech here, but this is the sensory of speech and words. Understand that right and left sides of the brain do different things. So in humans, most people's speech is on the left side of the brain. Then we move into the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is an interpretation lobe. It processes meanings behind different ideas. It has associations between things. It interprets the sensory and visual and auditory patterns. So for example, if we perceive chair and we say electric chair, although it's emotional, the association is in the temporal lobe. So when I associate a table and a chair together, that's in the temporal lobe. When I think of car and I think of driver, those associations are in the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is also the primary auditory area. This is where you process things that you hear. Then we have the visual cortex, the occipital lobes. This is where you process all visual stimuli coming into the brain. You combine vision and visual recognition of objects in the occipital lobe. If I peel away a hole here, I will see underneath the insula. So the insula processes your emotional interpretation. What that means is, if I put you on a roller coaster, you are going to feel fear and elation and excitement and anticipation. And all of those are coordinated in the insula. Dogs and cats have all the same emotions that human beings do. However, they cannot process them all at the same time. If you put a dog on a roller coaster, they will simply be afraid. They will not be afraid and excited and anticipating the future at the same time. That is too complex for dogs and cats to do. So the cerebral hemispheres inside the brain sit on top of the other structures of the brain. So you see inside here, we have some ventricles of the brain. We have the corpus callosum, which attaches the right and left sides of the brain. And here is what's called the thalamus. And I have 2 lobes, one on the right and one of the left of the thalamus. So here we have the cerebral hemispheres. We have the frontal and the parietal and the temporal and the occipital, and underneath we have the insula. And then we can see how the thalamus lives underneath between them. And then we have the other structures of the brainstem. So taking all of this structure out, we have all of this. So this is what happens when we remove the cerebral hemispheres. And underneath that, we have the thalamus. And there's a right thalamus and a left-sided thalamus. We can see here as well, another way to see that is we have a left thalamus and a right thalamus. So what do the thalamic lobes do? They have become much more important in our nervous system, understanding of the nervous system in the last 20 years. So the thalamus underneath or inferior to the cerebral hemispheres is a relay station between the lower parts of the brain and the cerebral hemispheres. So everything coming up the brain must synapse or attach in the thalamus before it goes to the rest of the cerebral hemispheres. The only structures that do not go into the thalamus before reaching the top of the brain is smell or olfaction. So the thalamus does some other things that are really fascinating, and one of them are pacemaker cells. So in the left and the right thalamus, we have pacemaker cells that every 40th of a second, 40 times a second, called global 40, is going to hit a downbeat. And the right and the left side of the hemispheres will hit a downbeat at the same time, meaning that 40 times a second, even though we're processing between those periods of time in the cerebral hemispheres, the right and the left cerebral hemispheres will compare information 40 times a second. You are not conscious between these downbeats. This is a way to establish efficiency in physiology. Now, you may have one thalamus running higher or lower than the other, which is one aspect of some of the developmental neurologic diseases we see, or syndromes, because if one side is much more dominant than the other, we have asymmetrical processing of these cerebral hemispheres because the thalamus is underperforming on one side. So we bind together the downbeats between the cerebral hemispheres and the thalamus. We call that global 40. This can be as high as 50 or as low as 20, but you want them to be equal. So below the thalamus is an area you can't really see here called the hypothalamus. Now this is the optic chiasm here, but underneath the thalamus or hypothalamus, and I can show you on your sheet, we have thalamus and we have hypothalamus. Underneath or below the thalamus, this is when we control automatic or autonomic situations. So in the hypothalamus, we are going to sense your body temperature and your respiratory rate and your heart rate, and we're going to respond to it by automatically adjusting your respiratory rate and your heart rate. We're going to respond to carbon dioxide levels. We are going to respond to your hormonal levels, your levels of salt intake. All of this is going to happen at the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus sets the master hormone levels in the body for running your physiology. So your hypothalamus is integral in your set point for physiology. Underneath your hypothalamus, we have something called the midbrain. So between you have the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and then we have the midbrain here. And the midbrain is the highest level of neurologic functioning in a reptile, meaning that a reptile has nothing above the midbrain. And so the midbrain's job is very basic startle. So when you see reptiles move, they move very rhythmically and they startle. So rhythmic or startled movements that we see in children with developmental disorders is very common use of the midbrain more than the higher centers. So the midbrain is also a relay area between the lower centers for the brain and going up into the thalamus as well. One of the most important things, again, is this is the highest level of brain in the reptilian brain. In the pons, we see a swelling right here in the pons. So the pons has a lots of attachments, what we call synapses, between neurons coming up and down the brain. And there's a whole other area of the brain behind. So if you see here, this is called the cerebellum. So the pons is a relay area between the cerebellum and the rest of the brain. Here's the cerebellum and here's the pons. So the cerebellum would sit right here. Below the pons is the medulla oblongata, the lowest part of the brain, also called the brain stem. It's your primary initiation of respiration and heart rate. It does not regulate it, but it just initiates it. It regulates some blood pressure by controlling diameter of blood vessels as well. So the medulla oblongata is just your basic running your functions of heart rate and breathing and blood pressure in the medulla oblongata. Now, if you go to your sheet, you will see the limbic system. So the limbic system is combining several areas of the brain together. Parts of the cerebral hemispheres, the thalamus, hypothalamus. So this is where you have memory and basic processing of feelings and emotions. Mood disorders can happen in the limbic system as well. So the limbic system really involves multiple areas of the brain in processing feelings and emotions. It happens equally on both sides of the brain.